Morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We will begin with chapter 26. Chapter 26, verses 1 and 2. We read the psukim yesterday that it was after this plague, in the aftermath of the Jewish people getting involved sexually with the daughters of Moab and Avodah Zarah, idol worship. So after the plague, God tells Moshe that he wants a new census of the Jewish people. And it's always interesting to try to understand why try to get a sense of when God tells them to take a census. Thank you. Okay, so going to Rashi on Pasuk Aleph. Vayhi acharei hamagefa. Mashal l'roa shenichnasu ze'evim l'toch edro v'hargu v'hen. So Rashi gives, imagine the parable that there's a shepherd and there's a flock of sheep and wolves entered. And after the wolves have been forced out, it makes sense for the shepherd to see how many are left. So there was a terrible plague. So now God says to Moshe, let's count. Let's see how many are left. That's one pshat. Tavarach, or another pshat. Kishiyatzim Mitzrayim, v'nimsru l'Moshe, nimsru lo b'minyan. There was a count taken after they left Egypt. So that was sort of like Moshe's check-in. Moshe's the leader. So this is the number that they have when they're coming under your stewardship after departing Egypt. Achshav, shekarav lamus ulahachzir tzono, machzirim b'minyan. Even though it's a long way until the Chumash is over, remember, Sefer Devarim is basically Moshe's last day. So we're near the end of Sefer Bamidbar, which means we're closing in on the end of the story here, on the timeline. So it's getting close to Moshe's departure. So it's like now he's going to on the verge of checking out. So now God wants there to be a count. It's an interesting thing to think about. Those are both classic pshatim. Let's go to the Kli Yakar on Pasuk Beis. Seuas Rosh. Tzorech misbar ze achshav. The necessity for this count at this point, Haya kadei lo dia, was for the sake of conveying. She'afal pi shenaflu esim v'arba elef. We're told at the end of Parshas Balak that 24,000 people died in this plague. Mikol makom nisharu shishim ribo. There were still 600,000 left. And we only know that because of the count that we take now. It's considered to be the full, like Klal Yisrael in full form. We miss every person who's gone, of course, but it's considered like a core number of Klal Yisrael to have 600,000. There's a special bracha talk about what a person sees like the nation of Klal Yisrael, but that's only if you see 600,000. That's the halacha. So similar to what we saw in Rashi, this is near the end of the story on the timeline. So we're getting closer to when it's going to be time to go into the land of Israel. So it's worthwhile to point out that despite the plague, they're still at 600,000. They're over that watermark, and therefore they have status as a nation settling in the land of Israel. Such is an interesting pshat to think about. Now, Kli Yakar now goes on to a new point. I just want to, before we see further in the Kli Yakar, if you look for a moment, just a random pasuk, but this is indicative of the story in general. If you look in Pasuk Zion, verse 7, Eila mishpachos haruveni. These are the families of Reuven, but it doesn't just say Reuven. It says a hey at the beginning and a yud at the end. The Reuvenite mishpachos, families. That hey yud is something, if you'll see in the psukim, God willing, it comes up numerous times in the count. So the Kli Yakar says there's something very significant about that. Mashachasma kol hashvatim shem shel ka. That which that hey yud, which is the name of God. It's normally we have it as yud hey, but that's what it's alluding to, like ka yud hey. Dafka b'misbar zeh. Specifically in this number, we don't have it in general when the numbers of Klal Yisrael are taken specifically here. V'shadayin lo hayu chashudim biznos ad shenichshalu bashitim biznos. This is a really interesting observation. The Jewish people stay in the desert. There wouldn't have been reason to suspect them of sexual immorality with other people. and certainly not with other nations. But now, in the aftermath of this story with the daughters of Moab, all of a sudden it's a different story a little bit. You have all these men with Moabite women. You could imagine people making a comment. Well, this tells the story. We see that the Jewish males are having relations with non-Jewish women. So you could imagine once this story gets out that the Jewish men were having sexual relations with the Moabite women, you can imagine her saying, and I wonder how many Jewish women had relations with Egyptian men in Egypt. You could imagine the sort of building the suspicion. Okay, Nemar, Hachanochi, Hapalui. Therefore, all these different families are referred to with Hey and a Yod. That like the name of God is associated with the families. Kishem ze hu misvavech bein ish leisha. This name of Hashem is presenting between man and woman. Lahoro shekulam noldim ben ish veisha asher shem kavenim. To show that they were all born from appropriate couples and there wasn't sexual immorality with the Egyptians. That's interesting. He goes more into the Hey and the Yud, but I just wanted to at least share the basic idea. Okay. Verse 9. So we're going through the different families. We're in the tribe of Reuven. We're going through the different branches of the tribe of Reuven. And now in verse 9, chapter 26, verse 9, Uvnei Eliyav, Nemuel, V'Dasan, V'Aviram. The children of Eliyav were Nemuel, Dasan, and Aviram. We've heard of them before. Dasan and Aviram most recently were involved in the story of Korach, but they were sort of like troublemakers throughout the Jewish story in the desert. But the Torah is worried that you might forget. Who Dasan v'Aviram, they were Dasan and Aviram, those prominent people in the congregation. Asher hitzua Moshe bel Aaron b'adas Korach, that they roused against Moshe and Aaron with the congregation of Korach b'atzosam al Hashem in their bringing a complaint against God. Verse 10, Vatiftach haaretz es pia. You remember the story? The earth opened up, Vativlau some of his Korach b'moso ita, and that swallowed them and Korach with the death of the congregation. 250 people died. Now, just in case you still wanted more data, verse 11, Uvnei Korach lo mesu. As an aside, Korach's son survived. First of all, these are basics of the story. These are all things, except that last pasuk, these are all things we knew before. Why does the Torah have to tell me this? This is just a few parshas ago. You know how many things are alluded to in the Torah? Why does Torah have to go into this? So let's see the Ramban. Ramban and pasuk tes. Uvnei Eliyav Nemuel v'Dasan v'Aviram hu Dasan v'Aviram. His kirakasa was that the Torah conveys this reminder, this tag of who Dasan and Aviram were. Lodia, to inform us. Shenishara kol Yerusha mimishpachas hapalui linemuel levado ki dasan v'aviram v'chol asher lahem nivla'u. Part of the effect of going through the family trees are to create lines of inheritance, and part of the effect of that is to have a plan for when they go into Israel. So actually, and as we already mentioned, this is the last count before they go into Israel. So this is important stuff because we want to clarify that Dasan and Aviram are gone, which means that the only son of Phalu that survived was Eliyav. So that makes a big difference for the laws of inheritance moving forward. So that's why this is not just like storytelling. The Torah wants to give us this context. Another possibility is that they lost their share in the land of Israel. See, there's a lot of discussion about it, but just to oversimplify at least one approach, the rights to inherit this land of Israel was based on the generation that left Egypt. And so the number of portions that are divvied up among the tribes, it's based on how many people and how many families each tribe had when they left Egypt. So even though Dasan and Aviram do not go into Israel, you would have thought that Dasan and Aviram's descendants would have their fair share in Israel, or maybe even the tribe would get Dasan and Aviram's share. But what we're saying is, since they played such a core role in the story of Korach, they lost their privileges, not just for their lifetime, but even for after their demise. So that would be another reason, whether it be for the inheritance within the family or having to do with inheritance in the land of Israel. That's what the Ramban says. The Or HaChaim says something really interesting over here. Or HaChaim and Pasuk Tes, Hu Dasan Ba'aviram. Tzarich Ladas, one needs to understand, what is the Torah teaching us with this Dasan and Aviram tag? What? It's to clarify that they're the Dasan and Aviram from the Korach story. Davar Pashotu, that's obvious. Eliyav probably only had two sons named Dasan and Aviram, and we've already known them as that earlier in the Torah. So this is the real. These are the real McCoys, as they say. The Torah doesn't need to clarify this for me. He says there's another problem. Not only do I not understand why you have to remind me that they're Dasan and Aviram from the Korach story, why do you have to mention them at all? They're out of the picture. This is supposed to be a census. Why do we talk about all the people who died in cloudless? I mean, like, what are we talking about here? We don't just say that they were involved with the Korach story. We say, yeah, they were the ones who aroused the nation against God. All true, but why are you telling me this? Venira, it appears, the Torah is coming here to teach Shehain Heina Hayusiba L'Chomasa Korach. The Or HaChaim is saying it's all their fault. They were the core cause of the Korach story. Ki Yachbot Hashem, the Farsim Harshoim, saying Shem Siba L'Resh Anasa. God wants to publicize the wickedness of these people, that they are the cause of things. Fu Omro, Fu Dasan, Asher Hitzu. That's why it says Dasan and Aviram. That's why it even mentions them. That's why it says that they were involved with the story of Korach, meaning they were the story of Korach. And it goes to further, it says they were the ones who aroused the nation against God. So that's a very interesting pshat. I don't want to take the time to see it inside now, but the Or HaChaim goes further and says that's the pshat in the next pasuk. Uvnei Korach lo mesu, sons of Korach didn't die. We say in the pasuk, in the story of Korach, that Dasan and Aviram's families were died also in the miraculous deaths of the story of Korach. But now the Torah tells us that the sons of Korach survived. Now there's a famous medrash that they did tshuva in the last moment, but the Or HaChaim says, you know what that tells you? That tells you that Dasan and Aviram bore even more guilt in this story than Korach did. And that's it's an interesting perspective. I mean, this is not to say that Korach was innocent. Korach was far from innocent. But what it is to say is that there are people in this world who specialize at causing problems and causing strife. And you just need to provide them a flame, and they'll provide everything else. And that's Dasan and Aviram. And it's an amazing thing to think about, that for all of Korach's ideas and for all of Korach's hurt and envy, if it wasn't for Dasan and Aviram, it wouldn't have been the crisis that it was. It's an interesting thing to think about, a very interesting pshat to think about in this psukim. So we discussed Rashi and the Kli Yakar as to why the Torah even has a census here. We discussed the Kli Yakar as to why here specifically the names are with Hayes and Yuds. And we discussed the Ramban and the Or HaChaim as to why Dasan and Aviram not only are mentioned here, but are mentioned with such detail and reference to the story of Korach.